Okay, good evening members, officers and members of the public, and welcome to this meeting of the Governance and Scrutiny Committee. My name is Councillor Justin Wrench and I will be chairing this meeting. I would just like to start by highlighting that this evening marks the first time that this committee has met this year, and it also marks my first meeting as chairman of the committee. I am looking forward to working with members and officers as we move through the year. Members, before we begin, please can I remind you that this meeting is being broadcast via the Council's YouTube channel. As we move through the meeting, please can I remind everybody present to turn off their microphones when they have finished speaking. I shall now proceed with the business of the meeting. So agenda item 1, apologies for absence. We have received apologies for Councillor Hume, but I believe we haven't for Councillors Santomoro and White, so hopefully they will join us at some point throughout the meeting. If there are no more apologies, I will now proceed to item 2, declarations of interest. So do members have any disclosable pecuniary interest, other pecuniary interest or non-pecuniary interest that they may wish to declare this evening? Please state the item and nature of your interest. So I take it that there are no declarations, so I will now proceed with item 3, minutes of the previous meeting. Before I ask for a proposer, I'm going to hand over to Angela Mitchell, who has an update from page 3 of the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you, Chair. So towards the bottom of that point, just above the decision, reference to raising a question around disabled facilities grants, and I said I'd bring an update to the committee. So the recommendation was around the procurement of a multidisciplinary framework for the procurement of stairlifts relating to disabled facilities grants. And the background to that being that the disabled facilities grants do not follow normal procurement rules, as the contract for the work is between the applicant and the contractor, not between us and the contractor. The DCLG guidance was that applicants should obtain 2 quotes. However, as a result of COVID-19, it was considered appropriate to limit the number of people entering customer homes. So there were occasions when customers sought only 1 quote, and this was accepted. Officers obviously see a number of stairlift applications, and they're obviously familiar, therefore, as to what would be considered to be a reasonable cost. The officers didn't agree with the recommendation around the procurement framework. They did consider this option some years ago and determined that there wasn't any real benefit to using the framework, and no indication that they'll reconsider this. They have a list of suppliers, so it gives customers normally the opportunity to go to more than one supplier to get a quote. The acceptance of single quotes was over a limited time, and that practice has been withdrawn, so they have now reverted to asking customers to provide 2 quotes. So we're still obviously getting a degree of value for money in asking for 2 quotes for the work. All the other recommendations on that audit were implemented. So, Chair, that's a short update on that for you.
Okay, thank you, Angela. So with that in mind, please can I have a proposer to approve the minutes of an accurate record for the meeting of the Governance and Audit Scrutiny Committee on the 28th of October 2021. Thank you, Councillor Mann, and I now seek a seconder. Councillor Waters, thank you very much. So the minutes have now been approved and seconded as an accurate record. All in favour, please indicate by a show of hands. Okay, thank you. The minutes have been approved. So, members, we're now on to agenda item 4, public question time. I can confirm that there are no registered speakers for this evening's meeting. So we will now proceed with agenda item 5, key financial indicators. So the report for this item is set out on pages 5 to 10 of the agenda. Can I please invite Phil Myers, Head of Finance, to present his report?
Okay. Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. So this is a standard item that for this committee, which brings a suite of financial indicators that the committee have in the past asked to monitor on a regular basis. So the indicators are set out in Appendix A, and then there is also an Appendix B which gives a thorough analysis of the Council's investments at the end of November. So just picking out some of the salient points from the actual report. In terms of the budget spend at the end of November, we were showing a positive variance in terms of net expenditure. So that's expenditure and net of income of £676,000 against the profiled budget at that point. One of the main reasons we had that variance is that we've seen a significant increase in income that we are generating from the recycling material collected from households and which is paid to us by the processing contractor. The report also provides a brief summary of the latest position that was reported on the impact of the COVID pandemic on the Council's finances, and that was returned to government in November, and that showed a continuation of additional expenditure and also pressure on a number of our fees and charges, particularly parking and some of our other sort of commercial income streams. And what the report also sets out is that we've received or we're claiming a mixture of funds. So we've got some funding that we successfully bid for in 2021 as part of the National Leisure Recovery Fund, which is helping meet some of the costs that we're incurring in relation to our leisure services. The government did provide some additional emergency funding as part of the annual local government settlement, and we've also got some contain outbreak funding as well from government, as well as making a claim under the government's income compensation scheme, which ran for the period April to June. And so we've made submitted a claim for £108,000 to partially offset some of our loss of income. In terms of staffing budgets, again, we've got a positive variance that we're showing at the end of November. We have an efficiency factor that's built into the budget of 300,000. So at the end of November, we'd expect to have achieved 200, which we had, and over and above that, 154,000. But members probably be aware that the organisation is going through quite a bit of churn in terms of staffing. We've had quite a few people leaving and new starters, so that does create some of that budget efficiency that we see there. In terms of rental income, again, quite a positive position there in terms of the income. So again, a positive variance at the end of November. And in terms of occupancy levels, we're looking around 98% occupancy in terms of the leased units that we have. There are 4 units that were vacant, of which 3 of those really were as a result, because they're only recent additions to our commercial portfolio as they've arisen out of some reconfiguration works at the Braintree Enterprise Centre that has generated some additional units for rent now. Capital programme, members be aware, we've got an ambitious capital programme that we're in the midst of with a number of quite important strategic schemes there. So the programme for the year is circa £38 million, and at the end of November we'd spent just short of £20 million of that, so just over half. And not surprisingly, a lot of that expenditure is on on the schemes such as the Manor Street, the Enterprise Centre, pedestrianisation, etc. They're listed there. As well as expenditure, we were expecting to also generate capital resources through a number of sources of capital receipts. So £17.5 million we had in our capital resources plan, and at the end of November we'd actually received, or we'd accrued, just nearly £18 million. So we've essentially achieved what we were anticipating in terms of capital receipts for the year. In terms of local tax collection, so our collection rates for council tax remain is comparable with last year, so almost 76% collected at the end of November. Business rates still slightly down at the end of November in terms of collection compared with last year, and part of that is explained in the report, where we had to rebill businesses during the year. So one of the retail relief schemes started off at 100% for 3 months and then was reduced to 66% for the remainder. So we had to rebill many of the businesses to reflect that change. So that did push some of the payment plans back. Looking at the statistics we've just recently generated for December, that shows that gap now between what we're collecting this year compared with last year has now started to reduce significantly. So we now seem to be heading back on track in terms of collection on business rates. In terms of write-offs, we don't write off a lot of money. We typically look to recover debt as much as possible. So write-offs remain quite low. I know, Chair, you asked a question about council tax and whether it was higher than sort of pre-COVID in the briefing before the meeting. So I did check in the intervening period there, and actually write-offs in 2019 were of a similar value, but actually the numbers were lower, so the average amount written off in 2019 was actually higher than we're currently writing off. So we're not really seeing any deterioration there in terms of our write-offs and the impact there at the present time. In terms of other debt, so there's £3.3 million of other sundry debts that is owed at the end of November. £1.5 million of that is housing benefit overpayments, which much of that is being recovered on a whole variety of arrangements and instalment plans, and that leaves £1.8 million of other debt, which is probably higher than we would normally expect, and that's largely due to there was quite a few large invoices raised in the period of November around the operations area, and so therefore I would expect to see some recovery or some reduction in that level of debt in future reports. In terms of supplier payments, payments within 30 days, we were achieving 96% of payments being made within 30 days, which is an improvement again from what was reported to the committee at its last meeting. We are going through significant change in terms of our systems there, so it is taking time to embed into the organisation, but the trend in terms of supplier payments is positive there. In terms of our investments, it's no surprise our short-term investments yielding very little, very close to zero, given the very low interest rates that we've been experiencing. And therefore, really, there's been no benefit and in terms of taking on extra risk in terms of our short-term investments. So much of our investments to date have been with the Debt Management Office, which is an arm of government, and also in various money market funds, which offer not only liquidity but a very diverse investment portfolio to hold our funds in. Where we do make gains is in terms of our long-term investments that are held in pooled funds. So we've got £19 million that we have in a variety of pooled funds at the present time, and they've yielded the equivalent of an annualised return of around 3.5% at the end of November, bringing in £442,000 of dividends. And those pooled funds, they are also subject to movements in market values. So at the end of November, again, whilst we have £19 million invested, the actual market value of those funds was £21.2 million, which represents an unrealised gain of 2.2. So a paper gain there, and which can fluctuate month on month. So as I said, there's further detail on the council's investments in appendix, which it gives more detail about the almost £64 million that we were holding in our investments at the end of November. Happy to take any questions that members have.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Do any members have any questions for Phil? Councillor Walsh.
Thanks for the presentation, and thank you, Chair. I've got three fairly minor questions, and they're primarily information questions and not meant to be superficial. Looking at the appendix, I thought I'd seen from other sources that we had a 1.2 million deficit, but if I see expenditure is 41.5 million and income is 42.7, which suggests a positive balance. A couple of other specific questions. Shall I pop them all through now?
Yeah. How would you like to take them, Phil? One in turn, or?
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah. Okay.
They're not very major. Going back to on page 6, paragraph 3.28, and forgive me if this is naive, but we said the collection rates on council tax was 75.7% and on business rates 71.8%. And I think you did say, Phil, that that's comparable to the last year. It seems to be, there's a gap of about a quarter not realised. Is that comparable with pre-COVID years and with other comparable authorities? And then the last question I have is on paragraph 3 to 12 on the next page. You mentioned council tax, sundry debts, 3.3 million, of which 1.5 million was in respect of housing benefit overpayments. Now, I do note that you said recovery plans are in place. Superficially, 1.5 million overpayments, is that normal, or because that's nearly half of the 3.3 million? So just an informational point, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walsh. Phil, would you like to reply?
Yep. So in terms of the first question, so the figures that you were quoting so basically the figures that are in Appendix A are sort of elements of the council's budget for 21-22. So we've got income of 42.7 million there, but then you've got salaries of nearly 20 million and other expenditure of 41. The net position is a general fund sort of budget of 15 million pound. So that's what those figures are sort of representing. The 1.2 million you mentioned, could you just?
I'm trying to remember where I saw that. It may have been in the press or at a members' development evening. I'm not claiming it's accurate, but I do seem to recall that such a figure has been talked about.
Yep. So the 1.2 million is what we're currently projecting as our budget shortfall over the medium term. So that's what. So we, as part of the budget process, we've been updating the medium-term financial strategy. So if you might recall, last February when the budget was set, we had a budget shortfall of around 1.6 million, and that was over the 4-year period. Through the work that's been undertaken for the 22-23 budget, that we've been able to address some of that potential shortfall, and we're now currently looking at a £1.2 million shortfall in the medium term. In terms of the second question, which was around the council tax, so you're right. In terms of collection rates year on year, for council tax, it's pretty comparable. It is slightly down on the pre-COVID collection rates, so we are still seeing an impact there. In terms of comparisons with peers, I think this is where the news is really good, because so far consistently on both council tax and business rates, from the information that's been collected across Essex, we seem to be consistently collecting the highest percentage on both council tax and business rates. So I think our collection rates are doing very well there, and that's obviously credit to the revenues team that are involved there. And your third question about the housing benefit overpayments. So, yeah, 1.5 million is actually less than it has been in previous. So on Appendix A, you can see the year-end position in terms of housing benefits, and you can see it's been 1.7, 1.6. But nevertheless, it is a debt that, by its very nature, we're collecting from people who really, need various instalment arrangements or payment plans, and there are restrictions around how much we can recover of that debt at any point in time. So it is a debt that is recovered, but it does take time in that sense.
Sorry, I misunderstood. Thank you very much for the explanation. It's very helpful. But overpayments, looking at it simplistically, is that not something that we can control and not make an overpayment in the first place? I'm probably being completely naive.
Right. So the recoverable overpayments are usually the circumstances where the overpayment has arisen due to the either the claimant not providing the necessary information, and therefore they've been overpaid benefit, or it may have been as a result of a fraudulent claim. So yes, the overpayment recoveries are usually limited to where it's been caused by the claimant's actions.
Thank you. Councillor Mann.
Thank you, Chair. Some comments rather, I think, than questions. I mean, given the context in which we find ourselves, this is a generally reassuring report. I think there's nothing sort of untoward, I think, in here that should alarm us. I mean, some things are reasonably positive. I mean, you spoke about churning staff, but one of the advantages is that you're appointing usually at a lower point on the salary scale, so it's the opposite to fiscal drag. You're in fact gaining because people are going to go up on their sort of yearly increments, and they usually start at the bottom of the scale, and the higher the salary, the more pronounced that effect is. I mean, at 3 to 5, I mean, the fact that we've kept up that level of occupancy for our commercial premises, I think, is remarkable. I think you said 98%. Well, that's almost counterintuitive, isn't it? So it does show some resilience in at least our part of the local economy. And a point that I would make, our capital programme, the massive sort of 37.7 million injection that we've done, I think that's sort of misunderstood by some commentators. I mean, I've read in the local press about, lucky old Braintree getting it all, and how about Whittam, how about Halstead. But remember that, I think we agreed that the purpose of this investment was twofold, to achieve eventual capital receipts and to create income streams. And it's only serendipitous that the land we owned happened largely to be in Braintree. If we achieve the goals of that investment programme, the whole district will benefit because it improve our budget position. It does appear to be sort of working. We've already got the capital receipt from those apartments in sort of Manor Street. We're building a new health hub, but that's not just going to benefit Braintree citizens, and it was done to get a rental income, which has already, I think, been secured. So, Braintree citizens are not benefiting disproportionately. The only thing that we, I think, directly benefit from is the upgrade of High Street pedestrianisation, and that was a three-way expenditure between the council, Essex County Council, and funds from central government. So I don't want people to think that other areas of the district are being neglected. That all benefit, I think, from this investment programme in both the medium term and particularly in the long term. I think that's about it. Thank you, Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mann, for your comments, and I have to agree, very positive report. Next up, Councillor Eusden.
Thank you, Chair. Phil, I'm going to go back to the council tax question. The 25-ish% that we don't get, we collect the money for all of the preceptors, don't we? And share it out once we've got it. So do we also share out the bits that we don't get? So the 25% of the money that we don't collect, do we have to absorb a bit of that, and Essex County Council takes a bit and the police takes a bit, or do we get stuck with the whole debt, as it were? If I've not made myself clear, I'll apologise and try and clarify.
So the 75%, obviously, that's the collection to the end of November. So obviously, we will anticipate that by the end of the year that we will have, that figure will be a much higher than that, and probably in the 90%. In terms of the arrangements with the county council, so yes, so they issue us a precept which requests a certain amount of money from us, and we have to pay that whether we collect the money or not. The money that if we don't collect money and it's ultimately written off, it's captured in a separate account called the collection fund, and that collection fund then we have to determine whether it has a surplus balance at the end of each year or whether it's a deficit. Fortunately, it's normally a surplus because our collection performance is usually more than or better than we assume, and we also see growth in the district during the year. That deficit or surplus is then shared proportionately with ourselves and the precepting bodies. So if there is a shortfall in collection, it is borne by each authority proportionately, but
Okay, if there are no more remaining questions, we're asked to accept the report of the key financial indicators. So can I take it that the report has been accepted, and please indicate by show of hands. Sorry, thank you members, the report has been accepted. We will now proceed to agenda item 6, internal audit updates, including progress against the 2021-22 internal audit plan. This report will be found on and is set out on pages 11 to 20 of the agenda. Please can I invite Angie Mitchell, Audit, Insurance and Fraud Manager, to set out the report.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so as you say, this is the update on the audit activity and progress and performance against planned work and any other matters affecting the provision of the internal audit service. The report also provides an update on the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act and Investigatory Powers Act applications made by the authority, and on that point there have been no applications in the current year to the date of producing this report. In fact, to tonight, there have been no applications. So in terms of progress against the 21-22 internal audit plan, paragraph 3.1.2 identifies the audits which have been completed since the last report to this committee, and Appendix 2 provides more detail on the outcomes of those audits. Appendix 1 gives a summary of the planned audits and the progress against those audits. And paragraph 3.1.3, going back to the audits which have been completed since the last report to this committee. Since producing this report, the commercial waste audit has also been completed with a full assurance rating, and I'll be bringing more detail on that to the next meeting. Paragraph 3.1.3 identifies factors affecting the work of the team. The bigger part of that extra work relates to the insurance workload. Chairman, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Do any members have any questions? Councillor Eusden.
Hi, Angela. Thank you, Chair. Just one question. On paragraph 3.1.3, you say, in addition, there remains a higher claims caseload. So it's just really a clarification. When you say higher claims, are they claims against us or claims made by us against somebody else? Thanks.
So both create a workload for us. The majority are claims made against the council, but there are some where we've incurred damage caused by third parties, and so we're handling those claims as well.
Councillor Mann.
We've had over the last few years a number of reports on average waiting time for applicants of disabled facility grants, and on page 18 you report DFGO 3, another one. What is the trend moving in any direction, or because there's been, you know, a range of problems, hasn't there, with the sort of the administration and distribution of these grants? Is the situation improving, or is there still you know, a very considerable time lag in them coming sort of to fruition in people's homes?
Thank you. Just to confirm, the audit that we were looking at was the robustness of the data collection methods and the presentation of the results to ensure that they were accurate. So I don't have the information you've asked for tonight, but I will make some inquiries on your behalf.
Thank you. I think we have had some mention of it in the recent past, but I can't remember where the overall situation, which direction it was moving, whether it was getting better or it was getting worse. we would like to see it better and hope that it is not deteriorating still further.
No, I agree, Councillor Mann. Does anybody else wish to speak on this item? Okay, if there are no remaining questions, we're asked to note the progress of the performance against the 2021-22 internal audit plan. So can I take it that the report has been noted, and please indicate by a show of hands? Okay, thank you, members. The report has been noted, and we will now proceed to agenda item 7, process for the appointment of external auditors for the years 2023-24 up until the years 2027-28. The report is set out on pages 21 to 30 of the agenda, and please can I invite back Phil Myers, the Head of Finance, to set out his report.
Yep. So this report is this is come to the committee really to just give the committee the opportunity to express any comments or observations in terms of the council's approach to procuring the external auditors. The decision on this will be taken at full council in February. So, essentially, the council's been invited by the Public Sector Audit Appointments Limited, which is a statutory body has been set up to undertake a joint or a national procurement of external audit for local authorities. So we participated in the on our previous procurement of audit, and as this report sets out, this is now looking for us we've been invited to join that sector-led option again for the audits to be procured for the period 23-24 onwards. So essentially, there are a number of options to the council. So we can join this national scheme, or we can look to do our own procurement, or we can look to do a procurement jointly with another authority or authorities. So the report sort of sets out in various detail what the purpose and the role of the auditor will be, and also the processes that each of those options would entail. In a sense, the report considers the invitation from the PSA SSA, and which identifies in paragraph 7.2 what the benefits to the authority would be in terms of opting into the national scheme. And I think that just pointing out in terms of the points there, although we would be joining the national scheme, it would still involve some consultation with the council, so we would still get opportunity to comment once the procurement process has been completed and auditors identified for local authorities. We would still have the opportunity to feed in comments on the process. So the report also covers in section 8 around some of the issues around local audit, which members probably be aware has had quite a lot of national attention recently, for a whole variety of reasons, really. Regulatory changes in terms of audits, obviously COVID has impacted, but also there's been some various reviews and changes in terms of the audit sort of framework. So the PSA, in terms of their procurement approach, they are looking to address some of these issues. So in terms of paragraph 8.7 on 25, their approach to procurement will be to try and address some of the concerns that have been, and some of that will be through how they allocate the work through the lots and the sizes of lots. They will also be looking to try and encourage new entrants to the market through trying to do joint arrangements, and also putting more emphasis in terms of the quality assessment, in terms of assessing bids that are made. So quite a detailed report in terms of the process and the rationale, but essentially recommending that the council once again joins that national approach, because there's probably a lot of benefits there to be gained from doing that. So.
No, thank you for your report, Phil. I have to say it's a very detailed report and it's very comprehensive, and I think the recommendations that we'll consider later are set out on page 21 as well. So, Councillor Mann, over to you. Thank you.
I think this is a no-brainer, Chairman, that we opt in. It does offer some advantages, but the alternatives, I think, considerable sort of disadvantages. We don't want to paddle our own sort of canoe, or to mix the metaphor, we don't want to invent the wheel if it's already there. Or try and reinvent the wheel. So, not opt-in has my our support, and I think we should follow Phil's advice. In terms of fees, we're bracing ourselves for continual increases over the next many years, I would imagine, aren't we? Because as government cut our funding, they increase the demands for audit of what we do have to spend, and given the state of the market, people, local government finances, we know is a niche area, and there are just not able entrants coming into the market because it's not worth their while. They can make much more money doing other stuff, and so I think in order to improve the number of entrants and the quality of them, then fees are going to go up in excess of what you're sort of indicating here, I fear, in the coming years.
Thank you, Councillor Mann. Just before I go to Councillor Welsh, Phil, would you like to comment on anything that Councillor Mann has raised there, particularly regarding the funding and the fees moving forward?
I think Councillor Mann's right, and as I say, we're already seeing pressure in terms of audit fees. So in terms of the current contract, our current incumbent auditor is seeking additional fees from the current scale fees, and some of that is being driven by the additional work that they're having to do around things like property asset valuations and pension liabilities, and they get more scrutiny from regulators. But there has been some changes that the National Audit Office has also introduced in terms of how auditors approach their assessment of value for money. So certainly fees are on the increase now. The government have recognised that there are further changes in terms of the local auditing regime, so they have made or are making additional funding available to local authorities. So the report sets out 45 million over the next 3 years and another 15 in the current year. How that is divvied out and how that bears in relation to the actual fees that we see when the contracts go out, we'll have to see in time. But yes, certainly fees are somewhere where we're seeing some growth, and we're already providing some allowance in the budget for 22-23. Obviously, we'll have to take stock again when we come to do the 23-24 budget, by which time we should know the outcome of this process.
Councillor Welsh.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks again, Phil Myers. Fundamentally, this is a comprehensive and reassuring report, and thanks for the oral summary. My questions aren't so particular this time. I'm just more trying to understand the process. assuming we go at the public sector audit appointments, I assume Braintree has considered the alternatives you mentioned of doing it on our own or with other local authorities. So my question is sort of in three parts. I assume we actually considered those alternatives. I'm not against the sort of recommendation, as it were, but are there any downsides to us of going with the PSAA? And am I right in thinking this would the external audit for us, would it be done just for Braintree, or would it be a sector-wide approach? Or put it another way, if we use the PSAA, would it mean that there'd be any less external scrutiny of us as a council than if we'd used one of the alternatives, if my question makes sense?
Yeah, so in a sense, whatever route we take to procure auditors, the audit process itself will be exactly the same. So, and that's purely because, and that's basically because the audit requirements on local authorities are prescribed through statute and through various codes and the National Audit Office. So, whichever route we go, we will end up with an auditor that will have to undertake the same work with the same level of independence that they would be expected to work with. In terms of looking at the alternatives, I mean, yes, so certainly in terms of the around Essex, you know, we've canvassed views of the Essex authorities, and the vast majority will be opting into this process as well. I think it's that the police and the fire, I think they did their own procurement last time, and are probably going to do the same this time. But I think I think it was 98% of local authorities subscribed to this last time. I think of the small percentage that didn't, I think there was a few authorities that ended up having to opt in because the auditors they chose at the time then, for whatever reason, then decided they couldn't actually do their audit. So I think the take-up will be very high. And say, I think, you know, we could do it try and do it jointly with another authority, but in some sense, this is a joint approach and brings, you know, even much more economies of scale. And we will still have some influence. Ultimately, the PSA will appoint the auditors. They will then advise us who those auditors are. We will then have the opportunity to feedback our comments as to whether we're happy with that, and obviously they will take that away. But ultimately, they will appoint the auditors for us. And that's probably no different to what used to happen when you had the former Audit Commission. This is probably a little bit more collaborative in that sense.
And sorry, there's no particular downside to this approach?
No, really, no, because at the end of the day, we've got to procure you know, an auditor in some shape or form. So no, I don't see any obvious downsides.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Probably seems a bit of a silly question, but COVID generally, I would assume, must be having effects across the board in all directions. You know, for the future, presumably government funding, etc., could be badly affected. You know, the whole issue it's not going away at the moment, and there's a certain amount of funding, quite considerable, coming from the government to assist in various areas. It's like saying how long is a piece of string, but it's going to be difficult, I think, because it's going to affect us in areas. I was having a similar question 18 months ago, but it is having effects in general. It's not just with staff shortages and all sorts of things, and costs will inevitably go up. Nothing we can do about that, presumably.
No, I mean, certainly in terms of the audit, COVID has impacted. So, I mean, you know, normally we'd have expected our auditors on site doing their audits. So, obviously, it's all been done remotely. But I think there's all sorts of challenges that have fallen on the local audit market that has made the issues difficult. And one of those, I think the report mentions that when the contracts were done previously, we did see quite significant reductions in fees, and that was probably premature against what was then coming on in the years after those contracts have been let. So there's going to be probably some catch-in. The audit firms are probably wanting to address that imbalance between the fees that they were currently able to charge and the resources that they're having to input into these audits.
Okay, thank you, Phil. If there are no further questions, we are asked to recommend the following to full council, and these recommendations, just for your reference, are on page 21 of tonight's agenda. So the first one is that the council approves the decision to accept public sector audit appointments, the PSAAs, and the invitation to opt into the sector-led option for the appointment of external auditors for the 5 financial years commencing from the 1st of April 2023, and that the council approves a delegation to the council's responsible finance officer, section 151 officer, in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Finance and Corporate Transformation, to consider and, if appropriate, to make representation on behalf of the council to a proposed external auditor appointment by the PSAA. So please, can I have a proposer to move the recommendations? Thank you, Councillor Mann. And I'm now looking for a seconder. Councillor Johnson, thank you. So the recommendations have been moved and seconded. I will now put this to the vote. So all those in favour, please indicate by a show of hands. Thank you. This is unanimous and the recommendations have been approved. So the recommendations have been approved, so I'll now proceed to our last agenda item of the evening. Agenda item 8, the draft Treasury Management Strategy for 2022-23. This is set out on pages 31 to 50 of tonight's agenda, and please can I once again invite Phil, Head of Finance, to set out the report.
So, yes, again, this is a report for the committee to consider prior to its submission to full council, so the draft Treasury Management Strategy will form part of the papers for the budget for next year. So the report just notes there that some of the figures in the strategy will be provisional at stage because at the time of writing the final budget recommendations were still being drafted, but I don't anticipate the changes in any of the figures altering the actual substantially the strategy that's sort of set out. So the actual strategy is sort of attached as an appendix to the report. Probably very familiar to members of this committee who've been on the committee for a while. So it covers off various elements that are sort of prescribed, I suppose, in terms of setting a strategy for our Treasury management activities. As ever, there's always an economic and interest rate context to the strategy, and that's been set out in Appendix B, which is a commentary provided by the Council's external Treasury management advisors, Arling Close. It seems strange saying that the big event really in there is an increase in base rate by 0.15% to 0.25%, and a central forecast for interest rates of 0.5%, potentially across the period covered. But nevertheless, that's the environment we've sort of become used to for quite some time now. So the report also sets out in section 4 what's called the local context. So it sort of brings together some metrics there that really just outline what the council's borrowing needs are over the medium term, what our actual borrowing is potentially expected to be, and then also what are the resources that we may have available to underpin our investments. And what the table at table 1 shows is we've got a borrowing requirement which is expected to slightly increase, but then start to reduce in later years. Our actual borrowing at the moment is expected to remain static until at least the end of this financial year, and then we may then see an increase in that external borrowing. That external borrowing really is related to a number of the strategic investment projects, Manor Street being one, and the Horizon Enterprise Centre being the other. So those are forecast figures and anticipated, but we do have the option, if we've got the capacity within our own cash resources, to defray that borrowing. So that is a position that will be sort of kept under review as to how quickly and if we do increase our external borrowing to the extent set out in the table. And what you can also see in terms of our investments, we expect those to dip in terms of the amounts available towards the end of this financial year, but then again start to rise in future years. So the strategy then really covers, in terms of the borrowing strategy, which is in section 5, just sets out that if we in terms of what our existing borrowing is, which we currently have £6 million of existing loans, and talks really about the strategy that if we do move to increase our borrowing, what will be the sort of chief primary objectives of that borrowing. We are in a situation where short-term interest rates are such that if rather than taking on long-term debt, it would probably be beneficial to take on short-term debt because the rates are better. But we would also need to keep our mind to the longer-term costs that we might incur if we defray long-term borrowing if rates are likely to increase. The borrowing strategy also talks in there about the Public Works Loan Board, which would be a traditional substantial source of any borrowing for the local authority. Members are probably aware from previous reports that PWB through government have been tightening up on the arrangements that local authorities have in place for borrowing from them. So very much if authorities are undertaking activities which they consider investing for yield, then that potentially potentially precludes us from using the PWB for borrowing, and that's clearly something that we would want to avoid. So certainly a consideration in terms of our capital plans going forward. The report, the strategy refers to our LOBOs, which is our existing debt, and those are a type of loans that have options. So the lender has an option and the borrower has an option. It's unlikely those options will be exercised in the short term, given the interest rates associated with those loans. But we are currently, and we continue to look at opportunities to potentially refinance those loans if we can. In terms of the Treasury management strategy, in terms of the Treasury investment strategy, that's in section 6. So that section really deals with what we anticipate our investment balances being in the coming financial years. So balances would typically be higher than our year-end position. So we tend to have a positive cash flow in year, which increases the amount we have to invest during the year. And those are set out in the table, in table 3 on page 38. And then in the table on page 39, we set out there in terms of the sort of approved investment counterparties, that we would look to place monies with when we have opportunity to do so. There's no proposed changes to those investment counterparties from what we've previously presented in previous strategies. So I think then the strategy then goes on from there. From there, really, it's just additional commentary around those investment counterparties, and just expands a little bit on those. So I won't go through those in detail. They're set out in the report. And then from paragraph 6.16 really down, talks really around some of the ways that we manage the risks around those investments. So it talks about how we would assess those risks, and how we use things like credit ratings and such likes to monitor the organisations that we might place monies with. Talks in there also around restricting how much we would place with any one single entity, and linking that really to the level of balances that we anticipate holding, so we're not exposing overly our balances. Talks in there about how we managed our liquidity as well, so that making sure we've got money when we need it at the time. So the strategy also then covers some of what we call in section 7, some of the Treasury management indicators. So these are indicators that we're sort of best practice suggests we have in our strategy to manage some risks around security and refinancing, and also about how much we might invest for periods longer than a year. There's some references there to use of financial derivatives, which is not something that we really actively engage in. We do have some exposure through some of our pooled funds and that, but it's not an activity that we deal in directly. And it also talks in there about the MiFID, the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, and just affirms the fact that we classify ourselves as a professional investor under the MiFID rules, which gives us access to investments that we would otherwise not be able to access if we were treated as a retail investor. And then finally, the sort of report then covers the financial implications of our Treasury activities, and just really sets out the importance of the investment income that we do generate. So 809,000 budgeted for the next financial year, and a significant chunk of that coming from our long-term pooled funds. Also makes reference in there to our anticipated cost of borrowing. So we've got the cost of borrowing and the interest payable on our current loans, and also the anticipation that our interest costs are likely to rise as our borrowing is expected to rise, and that increased cost is to be sort of met from the income that's generated from the various schemes. So, for example, the commercial lease arrangements with Manor Street, and the income streams that we're expecting to generate from the Horizon 120 Enterprise Centre. I think that's really just, those are the sort of key points I just wanted to highlight, but happy to take any questions on that.
No, thank you again, Phil, for an extremely comprehensive overview of this draft strategy. So, members, does anybody have any points or questions to ask Phil? No, it doesn't seem that way. So if there are no questions, we are asked for the following, which again is set out on page 31 of tonight's agenda. So number 1 is to recommend that the Treasury Management Strategy for 2022-23 is submitted to full council. And secondly, to consider if the committee wishes to propose any amendments to the strategy or provide any comments or observations which the Cabinet Member for Finance and Corporate Transformation can take into account when presenting the final Treasury Management Strategy to full council. So do members wish to propose any further amendments or to provide any observations? So I take that as a no. So please, can I have a proposer to move the recommendations? Councillor Johnson, And could I also have a seconder? Councillor Eusden. So the recommendations have been moved and seconded. I will now put this to a vote. So all those in favour, please show by a raise of hands. Okay, thank you, members. That is unanimous, and the recommendations have been approved. So, members, this item concludes our business for this evening, and I will therefore close the meeting of the Governance and Audit Scrutiny Committee at 8:20. Thank you, members, officers, for your attendance this evening, and to those watching via the YouTube channel, I wish you all a very good night. Thank you.
Just before members leave, can I